Hello, incurable creators, and welcome to this episode of Podcasting Secrets, where I'm joined by John Biewen. John is a very interesting guest that we have today. He is the host of Scene on Radio. Welcome to the Podcasting Secrets Show, where successful creators share their best stories, secrets, and strategies. I'm your host, Nathan Gwilliam. It's a podcast that's known for in-depth documentary and storytelling, critical analysis of American society. He is a professor, an educator at Duke University who is paid to produce this podcast. And they've received more than 18 million downloads in the last 10 years. It's been nominated twice for the Peabody Award, which recognizes excellence in media. And I'm excited to jump in and have this conversation today. Thanks for being with us, John.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. Happy to be here.
John, can you start off and share with us something outside of the world of podcasting that people might not know about you?
Okay. Well, it's just a little bit random, but it is something that I think my listeners certainly wouldn't know because I've never talked about it on the podcast. But I grew up in southern Minnesota, and I grew up in a basketball playing family. My dad was a high school basketball coach, and I had two brothers, and I played high school and small college basketball. And it's funny because now, I'm doing this podcast that's sort of, a lot about history and social issues and whatnot. And I just never talk about such things. But for the first 22 years of my life.
And you happen to be at a school that has a basketball team.
That's right. I hear that there's a basketball team at Duke University. Somebody mentioned that once. But yeah, and actually I'm not particularly a Duke fan, to be honest, but I do. Once in a while.
Can you say that and keep your job?
Amazingly. Yeah. I won't say it too loud, maybe.
Okay. So basketball was a huge part of your life in your childhood and early adult years. Can you tell us about how that has impacted you in your journey? How has basketball from those first 22 years impacted where you are today?
Well, that's so interesting. I don't know that it has in any kind of direct way, except, one thing that I guess I would say is that, the sense of having developed the amount of effort that you put in to at least trying to get good at something like basketball, and the discipline and the repetition and this sort of commitment that it takes, and it's a pretty familiar thing to say about participation in sports, but I do think that probably had an effect on, how I've done in my life as a student and so on, and just sort of recognizing once I stumbled into, actually out of college, I stumbled into being a public radio reporter in the public radio system, Minnesota Public Radio, later NPR, and to sort of see it as something that, I could spend years really getting good at this. That's a little bit like, getting good at anything, including spending years trying to become the best basketball player you could become. And I didn't, let's be real. I played at a, Division III liberal arts college with no scholarships, so I didn't get that good. But yeah, maybe that's, I guess, how I would answer that question.
So to sum that up, you learned that you had to put in the reps on the practice court if you ever wanted to be good in the game.
Yeah,
and
I think
that's
right.
helped you, in the podcasting world. You've learned to put in the reps, put in the work, put in that hard work you were talking about, so that you can be successful as you have been.
I think that yeah, that applies to anything, right? That one would try to sort of develop mastery in. And I would say I'm much better actually as a audio journalist / podcaster, whatever you want to call me, than I ever was at basketball. Of course, now I've been doing it for 40 plus years.
Yeah. Okay. Can you tell us about your journey to become a podcaster, and then your journey over the last 10 years to become a wildly successful podcaster?
Well, I don't know about wildly successful, but But yeah, so as I mentioned, I was a philosophy major in college. I had thought about medical school and different sort of things, and I wound up being, by the time I graduated from college, what I did understand about myself was that I was interested in ideas, I was interested in communication, I was interested in writing, and I by that time I had gotten a sense I can write, I can become a pretty good writer, and so uh, just a confluence of events led me to doing an internship with Minnesota Public Radio with their outstate station in Duluth, Minnesota for the summer, unpaid internship, driving riding my bicycle around Duluth on Lake Superior, covering the city council and the school board and filing stories. And I found that I really liked. Anyway, so I worked for Minnesota Public Radio for many years, and then I moved to Duke. I moved down here in 2001. I was still working for American Public Media / Minnesota Public Radio, and then I created a job for myself, you could say, at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke, which is a nonprofit Duke affiliated organization that does education, but also does creative kind of work and promoting documentaries. So I became the audio program director, but it was still part of my job to produce projects for the public radio system. And then when the podcasting revolution, or what I call the podcasting stampede, happened, let's say 2014, 2015, that was when I decided, okay, I think podcasting has grown up to the point where I'm ready to shift over into producing a podcast, which the big trade-off there, right? So I was producing one-off documentary projects that I would find a home for in the public radio system on one of the NPR programs, or I would put it out through a channel that distributes it to public radio stations across the country as like a 1-hour special. So I had a built-in audience, but I had to deal with the kind of the gatekeepers, say, of an NPR show, whether they're going to take your project or not, but also the limitations as far as the editorial control and the time constraints and all of that. So it was trading all of that for complete editorial freedom in return for having no audience, right? And having to now scare up an audience. So that was, but it seemed like a choice worth making. And I'm really, really glad I made that choice and started Scene on Radio in 2015. First episode came out in, I think, September of 2015.
So why are you really glad you made the choice? And what are some of the greatest benefits you've received from making that choice?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is being able to do with the show pretty much exactly what I want. Now, I do have bosses. For years, I was at the Center for Documentary Studies, and I had bosses, and I couldn't just do anything. But I guess the work that I wanted to do was in line with my superior's vision for what this podcast would say. So I just basically they never had any. I never got any feedback like you have to do something different. So it felt like really almost complete autonomy. Now my show is based at the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke, just a different unit within Duke University, and it's very similar. They're practically speaking, really don't have any particular editorial or artistic oversight because they like what I'm doing, right? So there's that, and that just it also. One of the biggest parts of that is being able to break out of the constraints. For years, I worked for something called American Radio Works, which was a documentary production house for the public radio system out of American Public Media, which is really kind of Minnesota Public Radio, national wing. And what we did was we produced 53-minute, 1-hour specials, right? So you're leaving time for the news hole at the top of the hour, but it's a 53-minute documentary. And that felt like, in the public radio world, this very privileged position, because I had this bigger canvas of being able to do 53 minutes on a subject, and I would work for months and to produce one of those. But now, actually, in the podcast, I do these series the podcasting series is quite a phenomenon. The sort of documentary style series. A lot of your listeners will have heard of Serial, which is the most famous breakout podcast series, which was a spin-off of This American Life, and they had this huge hit in 2014, Serial season 1, that had 180 million downloads or whatever it was, and really changed and really put podcasting on the map for a lot of people. And that was, I think, a 14-part series. So then I realized, oh, you can do a series which is almost like writing a book. So I've done these series that are 8 or 10 or 12 hours long, where you're going into a subject and you're going through history, hundreds of years of history. And this is a kind of work that I never imagined I would get to do on the radio. And so, I find it incredibly satisfying, and to have a, decent sized audience of people coming along on these journeys. It's my idea of a good time, actually.
Yeah. So a couple of things that you brought up here are a little bit different than how most of our audience probably do their podcasts. So let's go a little bit deeper into these two concepts. So number one is you pick a theme. Give us what some of your themes have been for the last few years.
Yeah. So the first one that really sent me off in this direction, was this podcast series that came out in 2017. We call it season 2, and it's called Seeing White. And it's about the history of white supremacy, or even the history of the concept of race, right? Of the idea that there's a white race and a black race and a Asian race or whatever, these very familiar ideas that we all grew up with. Well, humanity didn't always look at itself that way. And who invented that, right? And how did it evolve through time so that we got a world in which we've had, in Europe and in the United States, certainly, a sort of white majority that has used race to exploit people that are considered non-white. Like, how did all that go down? Which is a kind of a crazy topic to take on and to try to tackle on a podcast. But that was the first one, and that really kind of put our show on the map. That series alone has had going on 7 million downloads.
Wow.
And the series got a lot of attention during 2020 after George Floyd's murder. Remember when there was this whole people were talking about a racial reckoning, and there were lots of books and documentaries and so on that people were turning to understand white supremacy and the history of racism. That series got another life during that year because people were pointing to it and putting it on lists of resources. So that was one. We did a similar season on patriarchy, actually, in the history of sort of male dominance, looking at it in a similar way. Season 4 was on democracy in the U.S. and taking a fresh kind of look at how it has evolved and to what extent has the United States really been a full-fledged democracy going back to the beginning. That was kind of anyway. So that was framed in terms of some of the challenges to democracy in America from within in recent years. And the latest season, I won't list every single one of them. The last one was on the history of capitalism, which is, again, a crazy, just this little niche subject, right? We're just going to talk about capitalism for 500 years, over, say, a 10 or 11 hour podcast season.
And the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And
Cool.
To just take a kind of complex and critical look at these issues and these storylines.
Were you scared, or did you have trepidation at all before you took on that first controversial topic? Before you did that whiteness one? What were did you have any reservations, and what were your reservations?
Well, yes, I had various reservations. One was, can I do this? And basically, one way of saying it is so. And as I say this in the first episode of that season, there were a number of things that prompted me to do that. And what, if you look back, if you think back to 2016, that was, a few years after Trayvon Martin died, and a couple years after Michael Brown died in Ferguson, and you had the Dylan Roof, Massacre of the Charleston Nine in that period, Oscars So White, if you remember that discussion, and the Black Lives Matter movement had arisen, and there was just a lot of. I found myself sort of thinking, wow, here we are in the second decade of the 21st century, and we're still wrestling with race in this way, right? Because I would have thought, if you'd asked me in the 1990s, I had this idea that racism was just kind of gradually fading away, right? And then honestly, I have to say that the rise of Donald Trump as a serious candidate for president, and the way that, again, this is my view, that he was sort of playing the race card and the white identity card, that the way and people were responding to that was sort of the last straw in deciding to take on that series. So yeah, there was that. And I, by the way, I invited a friend of mine, Chenjerai Kumanyika, who's by the way, a very successful podcaster as well now. And he's a professor now at NYU, to work with me on that, to sort of keep me honest as a white guy trying to look honestly at whiteness. So he's Black, and we had these conversations as part of most of the episodes, where he would sort of keep me honest, and he would bring his perspective as a Black American to the table. But the other trepidation was, am I just going to lose? I had a pretty small audience at that time. The podcast was only a year old. Am I going to lose half my audience because white people especially aren't interested in a series on whiteness? And as it turned out, very much the opposite happened. It's created some buzz. It got some press, and other podcasters interviewed me about the project because they thought it was interesting. Things like that happened, and the audience grew tenfold and then 20-fold as a result of that series, and really changed the trajectory of Scene on Radio. And it's like, oh, this is what we're going to do. Actually, we're going to do these deep dives into these ridiculously large themes, and take a year or a year and a half with each season, do a bunch of research, go quiet for a year between seasons, because you have to do the research and the interviews and so on, and then put out another season on another big theme. So that's what I've been doing since.
Today's episode of Podcasting Secrets is brought to you by Pod Allies, the done-for-you podcasting services solution. When I speak with CEOs about their podcast, one of the most common comments that I hear is that they know they need a podcast, but they don't have time. Have you ever wondered how some businesses find a way to still run their podcasts while juggling their crazy day-to-day operations? The secret might be simpler than you think. Let me introduce you to Pod Allies. This is a service that's changed the game for businesses in the podcasting world. Pod Allies is a done-for-you podcast production and marketing service. They understand that while many businesses understand the immense value podcasting can have for their business, finding time to produce, syndicate, promote, and monetize a show can be challenging. Pod Allies offers a dedicated team to handle virtually all aspects of your podcast production. From strategy and branding to audio and video editing and guest scheduling, they've got you covered. They even take care of creating blog posts, transcripts, and syndicating your content across multiple platforms. What sets Pod Allies apart is their use of PodUp, their proprietary podcasting software suite. This allows them to streamline the entire podcasting process, saving you time, effort, and a bunch of money. If you're ready to become a thought leader, connect with your audience, and grow your business through podcasting without all of the investment of time and cost of doing it yourself, Pod Allies might be the perfect solution for you. To learn more or to schedule a free consultation with a podcast expert, visit podallies.com. That's podallies.com. Now back to the show. So a lot of times we go into a work environment and people give us the advice, don't talk politics, don't talk religion, avoid those controversial topics. But I think as a podcast host, we should think exactly opposite that. And I think you've shown through your example that when we think in a contrarian way to that advice, it can be very powerful. Instead of identifying the controversial issues or the things that might make somebody upset in our niche, maybe we take them head on and talk about those. And maybe that's what creates the most value and brings the most interest to our show. Any thoughts about that for other podcasters embracing controversy?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think in a way, and as a longtime journalist, I worked in newsrooms for many years in the public radio system. It's a familiar idea, of course, that conflict and tension are interesting, right? That it sells, if you like. And so I think in what we've done on Scene on Radio, it's not. I'm not trying to go out of my way to be provocative or something just for the sake of doing that. But we have sort of, I think it has been, the way I would say it is taking really sort of critical looks at things that I think a lot of us think we know. And I speak for myself as well. I've learned so much by asking these big questions and then sort of diving in, like, okay, so we have this idea, we have a society and a world that has historically been patriarchal, to use sexist. Men are kind of in control, certainly have been historically, right? And that's changed some over the last 50 years, but that's kind of the default. Was that like baked into human nature? Is that been the case ever since the cavemen, just because the man had bigger muscles? And ever since, men have sort of been in charge. Is that what happened? Or is there a more complicated story there to how patriarchy came into the world and into most societies in the world, right? So to start to ask a question like that and then find out who are the scholars or who's written books and who's tried to really look at the historical record to see how this played out, and go talk to those people and put it together as with interviews and storytelling and music and production to sort of lay out an engaging production that tells that story, right? So it's kind of not easy, but it also ends up being kind of edgy, I think, very often, because we're often cutting against what we think we know about these things. And so, yeah, in that sense, to respond to your question, that's something that I'm very actually comfortable with and embrace, and I do think it's good for our show. And a lot of the response that I get from listeners is that you've really helped change the way I think about this or that subject, and that's fun. Obviously, that's satisfying feedback.
Another thing that you brought up that makes your show a little bit different, or a lot different, is that you work for a university and you don't have to deal with the entrepreneurial side of, am I going to create a course to sell? Am I going to go sell some ads? You don't have to make a business out of it. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe what freedom that gives you?
Yeah, that's been a really fortunate thing. So in terms of my career trajectory, as I said, I was working in jobs with public radio organizations, Minnesota Public Radio, Radio Works. I spent a year as a staff reporter for NPR. Those were, full-time jobs with benefits and the whole business. And then I went from those jobs to a job at Duke University, at the Center for Documentary Studies, audio program director with a salary and benefits. But the main part of my job is producing this podcast. So it's a really very privileged situation, I guess, compared to many podcasters who are either just doing it as a passion project on their own time, or obviously there are lots of people who work at for-profit podcast companies or for the public radio system or others. But yeah, to have a job like that, and it means that I get up every day, and I do work from home. Really, since the pandemic, I've been working from home, and so I go from one room to the next room and sit down and go to work, more or less 9 to 5. And most of my time, I do teach one course a year to Duke undergraduates. I teach an introduction to audio documentary class in the Doc Studies certificate program at Duke. But most of my time I spend making this podcast and get paid to do that. So I'm very aware of being lucky in that regard. And there have been people, including people I know who work at other universities or are professors. For example, a friend of mine who is a philosophy professor at another university, and he makes a philosophy podcast, but he basically does it on his own time. And he wrote a piece once and actually posted it on Facebook, and he was talking about my job, and he said there should be more jobs like this at universities. More
Yeah.
universities that have money lying around ought to be employing experienced audio producers, podcast makers, uh, making good shows like this, because they could certainly afford to do that. But it's quite rare.
It feels like the core motivation is different. Where a lot of podcasters, it's about making money. It's about, creating that venture. In this case, it feels like the goal is to have a voice. It's to build reach and audience and push really good thought into that audience, right? Have influence in that audience. Am I saying that right? Would that be the motivation of why the university does it?
Yeah, I would call it broadly educational, right?
Hmm.
Like I see that, and I think that's why the institutions at Duke that I've worked for see it as valuable. So now I'm at the Keenan Institute for Ethics, which which oversees the classes related to ethics at Duke, and has these various programs related to thinking about ethics, about how we should live or how we can do good in the world, and so on. So I think they see my work as serving their mission, in the sense that I'm putting questions out there. I'm exploring issues like that have to do with how are we doing as a society, and could we do better?
Yeah.
Right. So that these are issues that are essentially are exploring ethical issues for an audience of, typically 1 or 200,000 or whatever will hear a given episode.
Yeah. And I wonder, so if you're a podcaster and you want a job like this, I'm trying to think how we can obviously advocate more universities to create these types of positions, to create these broadly educational experiences and promote the universities that way. That's one good way. I'm wondering if who else might want the same thing. They might want broad education on a certain topic. And maybe there's opportunities with nonprofits as well, where let's say you're a hunger nonprofit, then you go to a hunger podcast for that nonprofit. There may be other people that want that reach and that audience and that influence and that education, um, where you can go and pitch a job and use a podcast to help them achieve that mission.
I think that's right. And from nonprofits to activist organizations to, I mean, even I can imagine, and these things exist, right? I mean, even sort of business, what's the word I'm looking for? Business associations that deal with a certain,
Yeah, that's right.
right? Like
Professional associations. Yeah, that's right.
there would be all kinds of, and there are a variety of these kinds of institutions and organizations that create podcasts.
Yeah,
But I do think there are probably opportunities there that aren't being taken advantage of in that way.
yeah. Can you tell me the most challenging thing that you've been through in your podcasting journey, or one of the most challenging things, and how'd you get through it?
I guess the way I would answer the question is really just the challenge of doing the work that I'm trying to do in the course of every season, and probably just about every episode that I produce. There's a moment where I'm just flailing, and I think I can't do this. Like, it's too hard.
Yeah,
When you're trying to write a 45-minute episode on some period of history or some theme having to do with, let's say democracy in America or whatever, and you have your interviews in hand, and kind of where you think you started out thinking you knew how you were gonna where you were trying to go with this, but at some point it's just you can't figure out what goes next or how to organize it, or you lost track of what it is you're trying to say here. And yeah, it's just hard. And I've been doing it for more than 40 years for a living, and I still have those moments of just struggling to figure it out. And then typically, actually, what happens is I call it a day and I go to bed and I get up the next day and it's all of a sudden less daunting and I kind of see how to, how to go, where to go with it. And then it comes together. But those moments are always, just recurring in the
Yeah.
work.
What's been the most meaningful part of this podcasting work for you?
I would have to say the audience response and the audience feedback, which has genuinely surprised me. And anything, anywhere from, several thousand reviews on Apple Podcasts to emails and tweets and whatever, just people saying things to the effect that, I really learned something. Thank you for what you do. What you do, I really learned something from your show, from this series or that episode. And there are lots of educators, high school, college, middle school, mostly high school and college teachers that I'm aware of that use the podcast in their classrooms. And that makes my day every time I hear about something like that. Yeah, it just feels very, because that's, I don't have some Pollyannish idea about fixing the world through my podcast, but those little signs of, well, yeah, this actually made a difference for me in how I understand something. That actually means a lot to me.
If one of your greatest successes, I've heard a couple of really big successes from you. One of your greatest successes has been this amazing amount of reach, right? 18 million downloads. So you could say, what is the most important thing that's contributed to those 18 million downloads? Another thing could be another measurement of your success would be the minds, the opinions that you've changed, the points of view that you've been able to change through this education you've provided. And so what was the greatest thing that helped you to do that?
Yeah. And I guess, maybe what I would say is, that I have kind of stumbled into a way of working that involves asking really big questions about big things, right? Like racism seems to be a perennial issue in this country, in this world. We can't seem to get past it. And so to ask in a way, I'm not going to say that nobody's ever asked this question before, but to come at it in a way that say the typical journalist, and I've spent many years as more or less the typical journalist, where we would be covering a story about some racial controversy in some city or whatever. But this is on a whole different scale, where it's like, what's the whole story behind this whole thing, right? Who invented racism? And actually, to try to answer that question. And actually, there is an answer to that question in a way. You can make a case actually for naming a person, a Portuguese man 550 years ago who invented race as we know it. It's probably a little bit of maybe a little unfair to pin it on one person. But anyway, the point being to have this sort of the audacity to ask a question like that, and then to go as honestly as possible into an exploration to try to answer it, and then to bring it forward, and so that you can just try it for yourself first of all, but then for the audience that comes along, to try to understand something that you didn't understand before, in a way that you didn't understand it. That's pretty fun and pretty satisfying.
I love that. So to summarize that all up for other podcasters, have the audacity to ask the big questions, and then take the time to explore those and learn the answers in a new way. So learn something you've never learned before, and see something differently you've never seen before. Am I saying that right?
That I like it, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be the big questions, right? It could be, given, say, if you're doing a podcast about some broad subject matter, it doesn't have to be like ask some huge question like, how did we get racism in the world? But it could be a smaller question, but maybe one that hasn't been asked, or you haven't heard it asked or explored engagingly, and maybe there's an answer that if you don't know it, probably most of your listeners don't either. And maybe if you can go find an answer, or even just an exploration that's going to shed some new kind of light on it. I mean, I guess that is what I will say, is that I happen to be a person who loves to learn, and I know so many of us do. And that's what attracts me to podcasting as a listener as well. I want to listen to a podcast where I'm likely going to either hear some piece of history or some story that I didn't know about. I'm going to learn something about the world and the way it works that I didn't know before. That's what I'm attracted to. And so that's the kind of podcast I want to make as well.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, John, if our audience has enjoyed this podcast as I have, and they want to learn more about you and your work, what are the best ways for them to do that?
I appreciate that. So the podcast, again, is called Scene on Radio, and that's SCENE on radio. So we have a website, sceneonradio.org, or you can find the show on all of the platforms, right? All the podcast platforms. That's the easiest way. I'll mention, by the way, also that I write a newsletter that I've just started in the last few months, like around the start of this year. It's called Keeping Score, but score with no E on the end. That SCOR is kind of an acronym for Scene on Radio. So keeping SCOR. So like if you just run a search, Google search for Keeping Score newsletter with no E on score, it'll come up. Or it's buttondown.com/keeping SCOR. Those are probably the best ways to find me. I'm Perfect. On Twitter and, Blue Sky and Facebook as well. Actually, those accounts are called our Scene on Radio accounts.
And what's coming next for you?
Working on a new season. And I don't see any reason why I can't go ahead and tell you broadly what it's about. It's about media. It's about news media in our time. And kind of just about everybody thinks that our news media are deeply flawed, right? And that there's a lot of bad information and misinformation, and we don't have a shared narrative as a society at all. And so we're going to look at that, and also go back in history again and sort of look at the history of news media in the West and in the U.S. and bring us up to date on that.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting.
I think so.
Looking forward to seeing that. And thank you so much for being with us on the show today and all the value you shared.
Thank you for having me, Nate. This has been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.